Доброго дня, наш.
Good morning to our guests and all the audience online. The next event is presentation of the next report of UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Ms. Fiona Fraser, the head of the monitoring mission for Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for attending the launch of the 22nd quarterly report of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine that covers the period from the 16th of February to the 15th of May 2018. It has been 3 months since we were last here, and sadly not much has changed. Fighting in the east continues, claiming lives and destroying families. Allegations of arbitrary detention, torture and ill treatment persist. Conflict-related defendants languish in pretrial detention for prolonged periods. Freedom of expression and of the media face infringements. Violent manifestations of intolerance and discrimination are increasingly visible. Impunity continues to prevail, with no accountability for attacks against journalists, civil activists and minority groups, and no accountability for the violence and killings perpetrated on Maidan and in Odessa in 2014. Today, we commemorate World Refugee Day, and we are reminded of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who have left Ukraine and the 1.6 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine, ordinary people who fled from their homes, leaving behind everything as a last resort to escape the dangers and hardships of conflict. From the 16th of February to the 15th of May of this year, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission documented 81 civilian casualties. 19 people were killed and 62 injured. The highest numbers of casualties were concentrated around Horolivka and Donetsk cities. While relatively low numbers of civilian casualties were documented in February and March, there was a 142% increase in April compared with March, and another 32% increase in May compared with April. Preliminary numbers for June indicate that the numbers this month remain at similar high levels to those in April and May, which is indeed worrisome. The main causes of civilian casualties during this reporting period remained the same as during the previous reporting period: shelling, light weapons, and small arms fire. This accounted for 60.5% of recorded civilian casualties. The active armed hostilities continue to claim lives, the lives of ordinary people caught between parties who continually failed to live up to their promises in the Minsk agreements to cease fire. Parties who continually fail to refrain from firing weapons from within and towards residential neighborhoods. Parties who continually fail to respect windows of silence to which they have agreed. We are deeply troubled that during this reporting period, for the first time, we documented 5 incidents where civilians appear to have been intentionally targeted by small arms fire, 4 of which involve staff of the Donetsk filtration station. A total of 8 people were wounded by gunfire in these incidents. This is absolutely unacceptable. The intentional targeting of civilians is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and, if proven, would constitute a war crime. We call on the parties to the conflict to immediately and strictly adhere to the ceasefire and to implement all other commitments in the Minsk agreements, including the withdrawal of heavy weapons and the disengagement of forces and hardware. Further, we urge the Ministry of Defence to make the civilian casualty mitigation team operational as soon as possible and to vest it with the authority to effectively prevent civilian casualties. Critical civilian infrastructure continued to come under shelling and small arms fire, resulting in the damages of various facilities on at least 9 occasions and the disruption of the public water supply at least twice during the reporting period. Recently, on the 6th of June, the Donetsk filtration station was shelled yet again, resulting in damages to its power lines, which caused the station to halt all operations for 2 days, putting at risk the water supply for up to 345,000 people on both sides of the contact line. We urge the parties to prioritise the protection of civilians when considering whether to undertake any action, and to make all efforts to reduce the suffering inflicted upon civilians, minimise damages to civilian homes and property, and prevent further displacement of the population. I say this with many examples in mind when people living in the immediate proximity to the contact line are, at best, limited in their freedom of movement, or at worst trapped in their villages and not allowed to leave, or forced to flee and cannot return home. One of such villages is Chihari in Donetsk region, where a woman who fled to escape the heavy shelling told our team, "We were running 6 kilometers uphill with wheelbarrows to try to save at least something. My house went ablaze and we could not put out the fire. I was watching my house burn like a match." During the entire conflict period from the 14th of April 2014 to the 15th of May 2018, we have recorded over 3,000 civilians that have been killed and between 7,000 and 9,000 civilians who have been injured. 4 years after the outbreak of the conflict, remedy and reparation to civilian victims, especially those injured or disabled and the families of those killed, needs to be established. We call on the government to adopt a comprehensive state policy and mechanism of remedy and reparation for civilians injured during the hostilities and to relatives of those killed in hostilities. During the reporting period, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission documented 93 cases involving credible allegations of human rights violations and abuses, such as arbitrary detention, incommunicado detention, torture and ill treatment, sexual violence, and threats to physical integrity committed on both sides of the contact line. In territory controlled by the government, we continue to have effective access to official places of detention and to detainees, with the exception of access to, including information on, some detainees in Kharkiv in cases related to investigations by the state security services, which was unreasonably delayed. By contrast, in territory controlled by armed groups, we continue to be denied access to detainees despite our repeated requests. We are gravely concerned about detention conditions and the treatment of detainees there, as we know from interviews with former detainees and others that human rights abuses, including torture and ill treatment, prevail. Within detention facilities, despite legally required medical examinations, we still note a lack of systematic documentation of injuries which could be a result of torture. We continue to advocate for the implementation of the investigation and documentation standards contained in the Istanbul Protocol, and to build local capacity through trainings on how to prevent and address torture, ill treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence. The practice of torture and ill treatment, as well as the lack of effective investigation and prosecution of perpetrators of such acts, are critical systemic issues which must be addressed, not only to ensure access to justice for victims and to prevent future human rights violations, but also to foster social cohesion and peace efforts. Accountability is an essential condition for future sustainable peace. We have not documented any new developments in the investigations and trials concerning the deaths at Maidan. This reporting period marked the 4th anniversary of the 2nd of May violence of 2014 in Odessa. We still have to see progress in the investigations and legal proceedings regarding the deaths resulting from the disturbances in the city, as well as the fire in the trade union building that took place that day. I visited Odessa in late April and met some of the victims who were injured, as well as families of those who were killed. They are all pleading for justice. One woman told me, "My son is dead. This pain will always be with me. Yet, knowing that perpetrators would be punished would bring me some relief." In conflict-related cases, we continue to document violations of fair trial rights and protracted legal proceedings which lead to prolonged detention. We also documented state interference in the independence of the judiciary in Kharkiv, where prosecutors opened criminal cases against judges as a form of intimidation or retaliation for issuing court decisions releasing individuals accused of terrorism or separatism-related charges pending trial. This is a dangerous trend which threatens the basic tenets of fair trial and rule of law while eroding public trust in the government. Therefore, I call on the government of Ukraine to ensure that judges dealing with conflict-related criminal cases are independent and not subject to undue pressure. For Ukrainians living in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic, the Ukrainian court system remains beyond their reach. Within parallel structures developed to assume government-like functions, individuals are arbitrarily detained and held incommunicado, denied contact with their families or with the private lawyer of their choice. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission is concerned about the high number of attacks on the exercise of fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of the media, and freedom of peaceful assembly and association, as well as discrimination, hate speech, and violence targeting persons belonging to minority groups or holding alternative opinions. Over the reporting period, we documented 41 human rights violations and abuses in the form of attacks on individuals, public events, and peaceful assemblies. We are deeply troubled by 4 incidents in the last 2 months where Roma were forcibly evicted from their settlements and their homes with all their possessions were burnt to the ground. As we documented, there were 2 separate incidents in Kiev, one in Lviv region and another in Ternopil region. Extreme right-wing groups were behind the majority of these attacks against Roma and against peaceful assemblies and individuals who have expressed a different opinion. These groups appear to feel themselves above the law, even at times boasting about their actions on social media. We urge the police and prosecutors to prevent such acts of violence and to effectively investigate and prosecute those responsible to avoid fueling a sense of impunity. If these attacks are left unaddressed, victims are deprived of justice and of equal protection under the law. Further, the proliferation of intolerance threatens the rule of law, pluralism, and inclusiveness. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continued to monitor and document the human rights situation in Crimea, despite having not been granted access to the peninsula by the Russian Federation in line with the United Nations General Assembly resolutions, reaffirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine and qualifying the situation in Crimea as temporary occupation by the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation continued to defy international law by applying its own laws in Crimea in violation of the obligation of an occupying power to respect the legislation of the occupied territory. By holding Russian Federation elections on the peninsula, by confiscating private property, and by forcibly deporting or transferring Ukrainian citizens from the territory. Oleg Sentsov, who reportedly has been on a hunger strike since the 14th of May, is one of those Ukrainians who has been transferred out of Crimea. Following a trial in 2015, which raised a number of fair trial concerns, Sentsov was convicted of terrorism and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Violations of international human rights were also documented in Crimea, including enforced disappearances, infringements on freedom of opinion and expression, and a failure to uphold fair trial guarantees. I would like to be able to close on a more positive note. Instead, we end this reporting period on the 15th of May with an armed conflict now in its 5th year and the cost for civilians amassing by the day. The stagnation of the human rights situation with persisting allegations of arbitrary detention, torture, and ill treatment. an increased number of documented attacks on peaceful assemblies, public events, media professionals, and individuals. No confidential access of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission and other independent international observers to detainees held in armed group controlled territory. And no access to Crimea in line with the UN General Assembly resolutions. The government must take effective action to address the systemic lack of accountability and pervasive environment of impunity. Accountability, as well as independence of the judiciary, is essential to ensure access to justice, build public trust in government institutions, foster social cohesion and peace efforts. Before concluding, however, I would like to congratulate all those who participated in the March of Equality in Kiev last Sunday, and to commend the Ukrainian law enforcement for their policing and protection of the event, which allowed the march to take place peacefully. This clearly demonstrates the professionalism and capability of law enforcement to ensure that the fundamental freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly can be enjoyed by all people without fear for their safety. Let us hope that it serves as an example for forthcoming peaceful assemblies which will be held in other regions and towns of Ukraine. Thank you.
Дякую вам.
Thank you. And now we switch to Q&A. If you have questions, you introduce yourself, please, and ask your question. Good morning, Lyudmila Harpunich, ATR TV channel. I see that in your report you say that 70%, so responsibility for 70% of violations in the East is attributed by the UN to the government. Could you comment on that? And could you mentioned Kharkiv, that the Ukrainian authorities are violating human rights there. Could you reflect on that?
So you're correct. In the report, we are now setting out who is responsible for the human rights violations and abuses that we as the Human Rights Monitoring Mission have documented. So you will see a breakdown between those committed by the government, those committed by the armed groups on armed group controlled territory, and those committed by the Russian Federation as the occupying power in Crimea. The point of this is to draw attention to what the violation is, who the perpetrator is, and to try to aim to ensure that there is accountability and therefore justice for the victim. This is a normal course of work for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. With regard to your question on Kharkiv, yes, again, the team has been looking into the situation, the human rights situation in Kharkiv. We've been doing that ever since the Human Rights Monitoring Mission came to Ukraine, which was back in early 2014. Kharkiv is one of the 6 field offices, in addition to Kiev, that we have in Ukraine. And just as with the others, we are looking at the situation of a range of violations. But for Kharkiv in particular, we've been looking at the situation with regard to not only over the years of the ill treatment and torture reports, but also then how they've been investigated and how they have been follow through legal proceedings. So what we have said in this report is that in monitoring, observing proceedings in the court, we have found violations of not only fair trial guarantees, but also restrictions and intimidation of members of the judiciary.
Прошу наступне запитання.
Next question, please. Good morning. In your presentation, you mentioned professional conduct of the police last Sunday. What is the perception of the UN of their actions? Because me, as a journalist, I was there on that day, and I could see that, well, policemen attacked me, as well as other people who were there. So if we speak about the Ukrainian legislation, I believe that the police officers violated three provisions. They were beating people on vital organs. They limited the freedom of movement for residents of Kyiv, and this is counter to the Ukrainian legislation because it's only possible to do that if there are hostilities or some extreme situations. So how did you arrive at that positive conclusion?
We arrived at our conclusion based on the fact that many of us were, first of all, either participating in the event itself, in the march itself, and we also had a team of observers. We have also discussed the march and with the National Police, and I would suggest that if you have these series of allegations towards the conduct of police, that you take it to the police in order to ensure that it is investigated, and if there is any problem with the conduct of police, then it should be brought to their attention, and if you would like to also bring it to our attention, we can also address it to the police.
Агентство «Кримські новини». І я б хотіла...
Crimean News Agency, speaking about violations in the Crimea. Could you provide us with more details? Out of 28 the events, you say that in 25 cases it was the Russian Federation government that is responsible for that, and 3 it is the fault of the Ukrainian government. What is that? What kind of cases are those? And maybe over the last year, the UN mission, well, could you comment on some new developments, new types of violations of human rights by the Russian Federation in the Crimea, maybe some new trends that you observe, new types of violations? Thank you.
Well, I would recommend that for the details of the specific violations that we have documented during this reporting period, you go to the report itself and you will see that there are some main sections, including enforced disappearances, freedom of opinion and expression, forcible transfers and deportations, and housing, land and property rights. So that gives you a framework of where we particularly over this reporting period documented violations. I think that one of the key things that we've documented not only in the last year but really since the UN General Assembly back in General Assembly resolution of December 2016 is that now we have a situation where Crimea is under the occupation of the Russian Federation, as I've already outlined, and as I already set out, there are a number of differences to the situation that we've seen, therefore, in the past year, 2 years, in comparison to the earlier period, based on the protection that should be awarded to those that reside in Crimea.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Any other questions?
Уточніть, будь ласка, ви сказали, останні 2 роки захист
відрізняється ситуація в Криму? А чим саме? Пару прикладів.
I can't hear.
Oh, I'll try to repeat. Question was, the request was for you to be more specific with regard to the difference in the state of protection in the past 2 years. What makes it different?
What makes it different for us is that we're analysing the situation in Crimea not only from a perspective of human rights protection and the standards as prescribed by international human rights law, but also from perspective of international humanitarian law, Geneva Convention 4, which provides for certain protections for people.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Any other questions? Good morning. Thanks for coming, for making this report. Well, probably you are the only international diplomat who was granted access to our POWs. How our POWs held in LNR and DNR, for instance, Major Ivanchuk, who is held in custody in the Luhansk, the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, Korynev, Bondar, Pantushenko, and other guys who are Ukrainian POWs held in incommunicado, as a matter of fact, in Donetsk People's Republic. How can you comment on that?
Well, as I already mentioned, the most important thing for any individual who is held in detention is for them to be able to have communication with relatives, with a lawyer, and for us what's important, as well as other international observers, monitors, in order to be able to assess their situation, is to be able to have confidential access to them. And that is what we continue to pursue.
Дякуємо вам. Якщо запитань більше немає, ще є одне запитання.
Well, thank you. There's one other question. I am Andriy Romashchenko, national correspondent, is an online resource. If I may, I would like to take you back to June 16th events, Saturday. How can you comment on the shameful restrictions of the freedom of movement of Ukrainian citizens? Hundreds of people could not even get to their homes. They were denied access to their homes and had to stay overnight elsewhere. So how can you comment on those actions of the police?
Again, I think if there is a specific complaint towards the conduct of the police on June the 16th, that, as you allege, affected hundreds of people, then it first needs to be brought to the attention of the police. And I would suggest if that you consider that you don't have an adequate reaction, then you're very welcome to come to us and raise your concern.
Якщо запитань більше немає, на цьому будемо
Well, if there are no further questions, we'll probably adjourn for now. Thank you, Fiona.